The can opener slipped in my trembling hands as my daughter-in-law Jessica stood over me, arms crossed, watching me scoop the chunky beef and gravy into a ceramic bowl, the same bowl my late husband had used for ice cream every Sunday night for 37 years. "Eat it," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Since you apparently can't follow simple house rules about keeping your mouth shut, maybe you need to learn what happens to disobedient old dogs in this family." I was 64 years old, sitting at my own kitchen table, about to eat dog food because I dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, charging me $800 a month rent to live in my own basement wasn't entirely reasonable. Let me back up, because how I got to that moment, how a woman who'd raised 4 children, buried a husband, and run a successful bookkeeping business for 23 years ended up being treated like a punished animal in her own home, well, that's a story that starts with grief and ends with justice served so cold it could freeze hell itself. My husband Howard died 2 years ago this past March, and I'll be honest with you, I thought I might follow him pretty quickly. Not because I wanted to die, mind you, but because after 41 years of marriage, the silence in our house felt like it had weight, pressing down on my chest every morning when I woke up expecting to hear him humming in the shower. The man hummed off-key renditions of Johnny Cash songs every single day for 4 decades, and I'd complained about it at least 1,000 times. Funny how quickly you'd give anything to hear that terrible humming again. The house felt enormous and empty. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a living room that could seat 12 people comfortably, and a kitchen where I'd cooked approximately 15,000 meals, all echoing with nothing but my own footsteps and the occasional creak of settling wood. Howard had left me well provided for, bless him. The house was paid off. I had a decent pension from my bookkeeping work, Social Security, and about $80,000 in savings that we'd accumulated slowly, carefully, over decades of living modestly and saving every penny we could. But money doesn't fill the silence, and it doesn't make the empty spaces feel less empty. I started having what my doctor politely called adjustment difficulties. Panic attacks that felt like my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest, insomnia that left me wandering the house at 3 a.m. like some kind of gray-haired ghost, and a bone-deep loneliness that made me grateful for even telemarketers calling, just to hear another human voice. That's when my son Michael suggested I might be happier with some company around the house. Michael, my middle child, had always been the practical one. The problem solver, the one who could fix a leaky faucet and balance a checkbook with equal competence. He'd married Jessica 6 years earlier, and they'd been renting a cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town while saving money for a house down payment that seemed to get further away every year as real estate prices climbed higher and higher. "Mom," he said one evening in late September, sitting at my kitchen table where he'd done homework as a boy, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug I'd had since 1987. "What if Jess and I moved in here for a while, just temporarily until we can get our own place? You'd have company, we'd save money on rent, and honestly, I'd feel better knowing someone was here with you." The suggestion made sense. More than sense. It felt like an answer to prayers I'd been too proud to voice. Company in the evenings, someone to share meals with, voices and laughter filling the rooms that had been silent for so long. And Jessica had always been pleasant enough, if a bit distant. She was 32, 11 years younger than Michael, with short blonde hair that she kept in a precise bob, and the kind of figure that came from religious devotion to yoga classes and quinoa salads. She worked as a dental hygienist and had strong opinions about processed foods, proper posture, and the importance of maintaining life balance, whatever that meant. We agreed they'd pay me $300 a month to help with utilities and groceries, a fraction of what they'd been paying in rent, and they moved in just before Halloween. For the first few weeks, it felt exactly like the blessing I'd hoped it would be. Jessica would cook dinner most nights, healthy but tasty meals with lots of vegetables and lean proteins. Michael would watch television with me in the evenings, and we'd argue about game shows and laugh at commercials just like when he was 16. The house felt alive again, filled with the ordinary sounds of people living, shower running, coffee brewing, quiet conversations drifting from their room down the hall. But somewhere around Thanksgiving, things started to shift in ways so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining them. Jessica began making little comments about efficiency and better use of space. She'd suggest I might be more comfortable in the basement family room since it was cozier, and I'd have more privacy. She'd mention how difficult it must be for me to manage the stairs to the second floor where my bedroom was, and wouldn't it make more sense for me to move into the ground-level guest room, which happened to be right next to the basement entrance. By Christmas, I found myself somehow living in what had become essentially a basement apartment in my own house. Not because anyone had forced me, exactly, but because every conversation, every helpful suggestion, every concerned comment had nudged me in that direction until it seemed like the logical, considerate thing to do. Jessica and Michael had the entire upstairs, the master bedroom, the guest room that had become Jessica's office, the main bathroom with the good shower pressure and the window that let in morning light. I had the basement family room with its brown paneling and small windows that looked out at ground level, the half bathroom with the toilet that occasionally made ominous gurgling sounds, and a corner of the main kitchen where I kept my coffee maker and a few dishes. $300 a month had somehow become $800 a month in utilities and household expenses, because Jessica had explained that my presence naturally increased costs for everything from heating to internet to wear and tear on appliances. The worst part wasn't the money, though $800 took a significant bite out of my monthly income. The worst part was how Jessica had begun speaking to me, not with outright rudeness, never anything that Michael would notice or object to, but with a tone that made it clear I was now a burden to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. She'd interrupt me when I spoke, dismiss my opinions with little laughs and comments about generational differences, and ask me to check with her before using kitchen appliances or adjusting the thermostat in my own house. When I tried to talk to Michael about it, he'd nod sympathetically but somehow turn every conversation back to how much stress Jessica was under at work, how generous she was being by handling most of the household management, how difficult this living situation must be for a young couple trying to save money. He wasn't taking sides, he explained. He was just trying to keep everyone happy until they could afford their own place, which might take another year or two given how expensive everything had gotten. The final straw, the moment that led to me sitting at my kitchen table with a bowl of Alpo in front of me, came on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I'd been upstairs using the main bathroom because the basement toilet had been making that gurgling sound again, and I'd mentioned to Jessica that we should probably call a plumber. She'd smiled that bright, sharp smile of hers and said we'd add it to the list of household expenses that I'd need to contribute to, along with the carpet cleaning she'd scheduled for the living room and the tree trimming she'd arranged for the backyard. Jessica, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, these are maintenance issues for my house. I don't think it's appropriate for me to pay extra fees for basic upkeep on my own property. That's when her expression changed, the pleasant mask slipping just enough for me to see something cold and calculating underneath. Your house, she said? Mom, in the way she said that word, like it tasted sour in her mouth. This is our family home now. We all live here, we all contribute, and we all need to follow the same rules. If you're not happy with the arrangement, maybe we need to discuss other living options for you. Other living options. Like I was some difficult relative they were generously housing instead of the woman who owned the deed to the property they were living in practically rent-free. I made the mistake of laughing, not with humor, but with the kind of bitter surprise you feel when someone reveals themselves to be much smaller and meaner than you'd given them credit for. Other living options, Gisai repeated. In my own house? This attitude, Jessica said, shaking her head with theatrical disappointment, is exactly why we have problems. You can't seem to accept that things have changed, that you're not in charge anymore. Maybe if you learn to keep your opinions to yourself and follow the household rules like everyone else, we'd all get along better. That's when she went to the pantry and pulled out the can of dog food. Now, I need you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't just about the dog food, though the symbolism was clear enough. It was about the systematic way my own son's wife had spent months slowly, carefully stripping away my dignity, my authority, my sense of belonging in my own home, until she felt comfortable enough to demand I eat from a dog bowl as punishment for having an opinion about plumbing repairs. But here's what Jessica didn't know about me, what she'd failed to research in her careful campaign to transform me from homeowner to barely tolerated dependent. I hadn't spent 23 years doing bookkeeping without learning a thing or two about financial leverage, legal documentation, and the importance of keeping very, very careful records. I ate the dog food, every bit of it, while Jessica watched with satisfaction and took pictures with her phone. For Michael, she said, so he can see what happens when you don't follow household rules. I chewed and swallowed the chunks of processed meat product while staring directly into her eyes, and I let her see that I wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't giving her the broken surrender she'd been working toward for months. When I finished, I wiped my mouth with a paper towel, looked at Jessica's triumphant face, and said, I think it's time I made some phone calls. The first call was to my attorney, Mona Hutchins, who'd handled Howard's estate and who'd been after me for months to update my own will and estate planning. Mona was 71 years old, sharp as a blade, and had been practicing family law for 43 years. She'd seen every variation of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and family manipulation that existed, and she had very strong opinions about people who took advantage of grieving widows. "Dorothy," she said after I'd explained the situation, "how quickly can you get to my office and bring every financial document you have, bank statements, property deeds, utility bills, everything? We're going to need to move fast on this." The second call was to my neighbor Ellen, who'd been my friend for 15 years, and who'd watched with growing concern as I'd seemed to disappear into my own basement over the past few months. Ellen was a retired nurse, practical and observant, and she'd been waiting for me to ask for help with a patience that humbled me. "Honey," she said, "you pack a bag and come stay with me for a few days, right now. Don't tell them where you're going and don't leave a note. We need to establish that you have other options besides living in what sounds like prison conditions in your own home." The third call was to Michael's older brother David, my eldest son, who lived 2 states away and who'd always been protective of family, sometimes to a fault. David was a high school principal, a man who'd spent his career dealing with bullies and manipulation, and he had very little patience for people who preyed on those they perceived as vulnerable. "Mom yato," he said, after I'd given him the abbreviated version of recent events. "I'm driving down this weekend, and I'm bringing Sarah," his wife, who was a social worker specializing in elder advocacy, "because this situation needs professional documentation. You don't deserve to be treated like this, and Michael needs to understand exactly what his wife has been doing to his mother." By Thursday evening, I was installed in Ellen's guest bedroom with a suitcase full of clothes and a banker's box full of financial documents. Mona had spent 2 days reviewing everything and making phone calls to establish what she called the legal framework for protecting your interests and reclaiming your autonomy. David was driving down from Pennsylvania with Sarah in a car full of righteous indignation, and Jessica was calling my phone every hour, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that progressed from sweet concern about my whereabouts to barely controlled anger about my irresponsible behavior to something approaching panic as she began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she'd pushed the wrong person too far. I didn't answer the phone. Mona's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its thoroughness. First, we'd established that I'd been the victim of what legally constituted elder abuse and financial exploitation. The photographs Jessica had taken of me eating dog food, which she'd apparently shared with several friends as amusing evidence of putting the old lady in her place, would serve as documented proof of psychological abuse. The systematic isolation, the excessive rent charged for basement living quarters, the gradual restriction of my access to my own home, all of it constituted a pattern of exploitation designed to make me financially and emotionally dependent on my abusers. Second, we'd make it clear that I had every legal right to terminate their tenancy immediately, since they'd never had a proper lease agreement and had violated what Mona called basic standards of human decency that are implied in any residential arrangement. They had 30 days to find alternative housing, during which time they would be required to pay market rate rent, about $1,200 a month for their current living situation, or face eviction proceedings. Third, and most importantly, we'd establish new legal protections for my future well-being. Mona was helping me create a comprehensive estate plan that would prevent anyone from taking advantage of me again, including power of attorney arrangements with David rather than Michael, and a living trust that would protect my assets from the family members who might see my aging as an opportunity for financial gain. But the real stroke of genius was Mona's suggestion about the house itself. Over the past few months, property values in our neighborhood had increased dramatically, something I'd been vaguely aware of but hadn't really focused on. My house, which Howard and I had bought for $67,000 in 1989, was now worth nearly $400,000. Mona suggested I might want to consider selling it and moving into a smaller place that would be easier to maintain and harder for manipulative family members to move into uninvited. "Dorothy," she said, "you could sell this house, buy a lovely 2-bedroom condo or townhouse for half the price, and have $200,000 in cash to ensure your independence for the rest of your life. No one could ever put you in a position where you're financially vulnerable again." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. This house held 40 years of memories. Howard's humming in the shower, children's birthday parties in the backyard, Christmas mornings around the tree in the living room, quiet evenings reading together on the couch. But it also held the recent memories of being made to feel like an intruder in my own home, of eating dog food while my daughter-in-law took pictures, of hiding in a basement like some kind of shameful secret. Maybe it was time for new memories in a place where no one could make me feel small. David arrived on Friday evening, took one look at the pictures Jessica had sent around, and went immediately to the house to have what he called a clarifying conversation with his younger brother. I don't know exactly what was said, but when he came back to Ellen's house 2 hours later, his face was grim and his voice was tight with barely controlled free. "Mom," he said, "Michael is either completely oblivious to what's been happening, or he's been willfully ignoring it because it was convenient. Either way, he's about to get a very unpleasant education and consequences." Jessica tried to convince him that you'd been difficult and unreasonable lately, but when I showed him those pictures and explained exactly what's been going on, I watched my little brother realize that his wife had been systematically abusing his mother for months, while he looked the other way. Sarah, David's wife, was even more direct. "Dorothy, what you've been experiencing is classic elder abuse, isolation, financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and degradation designed to make you feel powerless. The dog food incident alone is grounds for criminal charges if you wanted to pursue them. This woman saw your grief and vulnerability after Howard's death and used it to take control of your life and your assets. She's not going to stop unless she's forced to stop." On Monday morning, Mona and I walked into my house, while Jessica was at work and Michael was on a job site. We spent 3 hours documenting the living conditions in the basement, photographing evidence of my relegation to what essentially amounted to servants' quarters, and changing the locks on all the doors. When Jessica came home that afternoon, she found an envelope taped to the front door containing a legal notice of tenancy termination, a restraining order that prohibited her from entering the property without supervision, and a detailed explanation of her options for avoiding criminal charges related to elder abuse. I was sitting in the living room when she finally managed to reach Michael and get him to come home and let her in. Through the window, I could see her on the front porch, pacing and gesturing wildly while she talked on her phone, her carefully controlled composure completely shattered by the realization that her victim had turned out to have teeth after all. Michael came through the door looking like a man who'd been hit by a truck and hadn't quite figured out what had happened to him. His eyes were red-rimmed and confused, his usual confident posture replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked a little on the word. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have known, but I didn't want to see it. And I let her—" He stopped, shook his head, tried again. "There's no excuse for what happened. None. What she did to you, what I let her do to you, it's unforgivable." Jessica pushed past him into the house, her face flushed and her bob haircut looking disheveled for the first time since I'd known her. "This is ridiculous," she announced, waving the legal papers like they were something personally offensive. "Mom, you're being manipulated by lawyers who just want to take your money. We're family. We can work this out like reasonable adults instead of involving courts and attorneys and all this unnecessary drama." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something settle into place in my chest. Something that felt like cold steel wrapped in velvet. "Jessica, huh?" I said, my voice perfectly calm. "3 days ago, you made me eat dog food and took pictures of it for your amusement. Today, you're standing in my living room talking about being reasonable adults. Do you see the disconnect there?" She opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to realize that anything she said would only make things worse. The photographs existed. The witnesses existed. The pattern of abuse was documented and undeniable. Her carefully constructed narrative of being the put-upon daughter-in-law dealing with a difficult elderly woman had collapsed the moment actual evidence entered the picture. Mona had warned me that Jessica would likely try one of 3 approaches: denial and gaslighting, emotional manipulation and fake remorse, or angry threats and blame shifting. Jessica, being both predictable and not quite as clever as she thought she was, tried all 3 in the span of 10 minutes. First, she attempted to reframe the dog food incident as a misunderstanding and a poor attempt at humor that I had taken too seriously. Then she dissolved into tears about how stressful the living situation had been for everyone and how she'd never meant for things to go so far. Finally, when neither of those approaches had any visible effect on me, she pivoted to anger, accusing me of being vindictive and tearing the family apart out of spite. Through it all, I sat in my chair, Howard's old recliner, which I'd reclaimed from the basement and moved back to its rightful place in the living room, and watched her performance with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly interesting scientific experiment. This was the woman who'd spent months making me feel like an unwelcome intruder in my own home, and now she was falling apart because she'd discovered that actions have consequences, and elderly women sometimes have more resources than their abusers expect. Michael stood in the middle of the room looking like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. "Mom," he said finally, "what do you want us to do? I mean, we can find another place to live, obviously, but is there any way can we fix this? Can our family recover from this? It was a fair question, and I'd been thinking about it for days. The truth was, I loved my son. I'd always love him, despite his willingness to let his wife treat me like a disobedient pet for the sake of domestic peace. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse, and it doesn't mean pretending that serious violations of trust and dignity can be smoothed over with apologies and good intentions. Michael, I said, I need you to understand something. This isn't about punishment or revenge. This is about the fact that I cannot trust either of you to treat me with basic human dignity in my own home. Jessica made me eat dog food, took pictures of it, and shared those pictures with other people as entertainment. You knew she was charging me $800 a month to live in my own basement and didn't see a problem with it. These aren't small mistakes or misunderstandings. These are fundamental failures of character and respect. I paused, looking at both of them, and felt that strange sense of clarity that comes when you finally stop trying to make other people comfortable with their own bad behavior. I'm selling the house, I announced. Mona has already connected me with a real estate agent and will be listing it within the month. You have 30 days to find other accommodations, during which time you'll pay market rate rent if you choose to stay. After that, this house will belong to someone else, and I'll be living somewhere that no one can make me feel unwelcome. Jessica's face went white. You wouldn't, Mom. This is Michael's childhood home. You can't just sell it out from under your own family. I can, I said simply, and I am. This house has been turned into a place where I was made to feel like a burden and a nuisance. I see no reason to keep it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of real estate showings, packing, and legal paperwork. Jessica and Michael found a rental house across town, a cramped 3-bedroom place that cost them $1,800 a month, more than twice what they'd been paying me for the privilege of making me live in my own basement. Jessica tried calling me several times to negotiate, plead, and eventually threaten, but I'd changed my phone number and given the new one only to people I actually wanted to hear from. My house sold in 6 days for $15,000 over asking price to a young couple with twin toddlers who were delighted by the big backyard and the good school district. I bought a 2-bedroom townhouse in a community designed for active adults, not a nursing home or a retirement village, but a place where people my age lived independently in homes they owned, with a community center, walking trails, and neighbors who understood that aging doesn't mean accepting disrespect from anyone, including family members. The financial math was even better than Mona had predicted. After paying off the few remaining debts Howard and I had accumulated, setting aside money for taxes, and purchasing my new home outright, I had nearly $250,000 in investments that would provide me with additional income for the rest of my life. I was more financially secure at 64 than I'd ever been, with a home that was entirely mine and resources that no one could manipulate or exploit. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the morning I woke up in my new bedroom, made coffee in my own kitchen without asking anyone's permission, and realized that I felt like myself again for the first time in over a year. No one was monitoring my use of hot water or complaining about my television choices or suggesting that I'd be more comfortable somewhere else. I was Dorothy Brennan, homeowner, independent woman, and someone who would never again mistake temporary loneliness for a reason to accept permanent disrespect. David called me every Sunday, and we talked for an hour about his work, his children, and the small details of our separate lives. He'd apologized dozens of times for not seeing what was happening sooner, for not stepping in when Jessica's behavior first began crossing lines, for assuming that Michael would protect me when he was too busy protecting his own comfort to notice his mother's dignity being systematically stripped away. You don't need to keep apologizing, I told him one Sunday in May, sitting on my new back patio with a cup of coffee and a mystery novel, watching rabbits graze in the small garden I'd planted. What matters is that when I needed help, you were there. That's what family is supposed to do. Michael had sent a letter, an actual handwritten letter, about 6 weeks after I moved out. It was 3 pages of apologies, self-recrimination, and promises to do better. He'd left Jessica, he wrote, after finally understanding the full extent of what she'd done and his own role in enabling it. He was living alone in a studio apartment, going to counseling, and trying to figure out how to rebuild his life and possibly, someday, earn back some portion of my trust and respect. I wrote him back, a short note thanking him for his honesty and telling him that I loved him, but that our relationship would need to be rebuilt slowly, with clear boundaries and demonstrated change rather than just good intentions. Some things, once broken, require time and proof to heal, And a mother being made to eat dog food by her son's wife while he looked the other way was one of those things. Jessica, according to Ellen, who still lived in the old neighborhood and kept track of local gossip, had moved back in with her parents after the separation and was telling anyone who would listen that I was a vindictive old woman who had destroyed her marriage out of spite. Ellen, bless her, had made sure to share the true story, including the photographs, with enough people that Jessica's version wasn't gaining much traction. Apparently, most people had strong feelings about elderly women being forced to eat dog food by younger family members, and those feelings weren't sympathetic to Jessica's position. I found that I didn't care much about Jessica's opinion of me or her attempts to rewrite history. She'd revealed her character clearly enough during our months living together, and her current behavior only confirmed what I'd already learned about her. Some people, when caught doing terrible things, apologize and try to make amends. Others double down and try to convince everyone that their victims deserve their treatment. Jessica had chosen her approach, and it told me everything I needed to know about the wisdom of removing her from my life permanently. The townhouse community turned out to be exactly what I needed. My neighbors were people like me, mostly widowed or divorced, financially independent, interested in quiet lives with occasional social activities and minimal drama. We had book clubs and walking groups, potluck dinners and movie nights, but everyone understood that the primary appeal of living here was being able to do what you wanted in your own space without interference from people who thought they knew better than you did about your own life. I made friends with Charlotte Camps, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down and who'd also escaped from a living situation with adult children that had become more controlling than supportive. We'd have coffee on Tuesday mornings and share stories about the strange process of reclaiming your independence after years of being treated like you were gradually becoming incompetent to manage your own affairs. The hardest part, Charlotte said one morning, isn't dealing with the people who were treating you badly. It's forgiving yourself for accepting that treatment for so long. I kept thinking I should have stood up for myself sooner, should have seen what was happening before it got so bad. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. I think grief makes us vulnerable in ways that aren't immediately obvious. When Howard died, I felt so lost and disconnected that having people around seemed worth almost any price. It took me a while to realize that some prices are too high to pay, even for company. By autumn, I'd established a routine that felt both comfortable and purposeful. I volunteered at the local library twice a week, helping people with tax preparation and basic bookkeeping, skills that turned out to be in high demand among retirees dealing with complex financial situations. I joined a hiking group that explored local trails every Saturday morning, rediscovering the simple pleasure of walking in the woods with people who appreciated both nature and good conversation. Most surprisingly, I started dating. Not seriously, and not with any intention of replacing Howard or replicating the marriage I'd had for 41 years, but enjoying the company of men who were interesting and respectful and who understood that women my age had full lives and opinions and resources of our own. Howard had been gone for almost 3 years now, and while I'd always miss him, I was discovering that grief didn't have to mean the end of all possibility for companionship and affection. James Patterson, not the author, as he was always quick to clarify, but a retired engineer who'd moved to the community after his wife died 2 years earlier, had become a particular friend. We'd go to movies together, share dinner once or twice a week, and spend long evenings talking about books and politics and the strange process of building a new kind of life after losing the person you'd expected to grow old with. He was kind and funny and treated me like an equal partner in whatever we were doing together, which after my experiences with Jessica felt like a precious and remarkable gift. One evening in late October, James and I were sitting on my patio, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset, talking about nothing particularly important, when he asked me a question that surprised me. Dorothy from Opikimap? Yeah, he said, Si c'était un, did you ever regret how you handled the situation with your son and daughter-in-law? I mean, selling the house and cutting them off so completely. Do you ever wonder if you should have tried harder to work things out? I thought about it for a moment, really considered the question rather than giving an automatic answer. It was something I'd wondered about myself, particularly during the first few weeks after moving out, when the shock of taking such decisive action had worn off and the full implications of what I'd done began to sink in. No, I said finally. I don't regret it. What I regret is how long I let it go on. I regret accepting the first month's rent payment for living in my own basement. I regret not speaking up the first time Jessica talked to me like I was a disobedient child. I regret not trusting my own instincts when I started feeling uncomfortable in my own home, but standing up for myself, protecting my dignity, ensuring my financial security, No, I don't regret any of that. I paused, watching a hawk circle slowly overhead, thinking about the woman I'd been 3 years ago and the woman I was now. James, when someone forces you to eat dog food and takes pictures of it for entertainment, they've crossed a line that doesn't get uncrossed with apologies and good intentions. That kind of cruelty reveals something fundamental about a person's character, and it tells you exactly how much respect they have for your humanity. I couldn't continue living with people who saw me as something less than human, regardless of how inconvenient it was for them to lose their comfortable housing arrangement. He nodded, reaching over to squeeze my hand. You're absolutely right. I just wanted to make sure you weren't carrying guilt about protecting yourself. Some people have trouble with that. They've been taught that being nice means accepting whatever treatment people give them, even when that treatment is abusive. That night, after James had gone home, I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea and really thought about the past year and a half. From eating dog food in my own kitchen to sitting in my own townhouse, financially secure and emotionally independent, surrounded by people who treated me with respect and kindness. From feeling like an unwelcome burden in my own home to feeling like a valued member of a community where my opinions mattered and my contributions were appreciated. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been legal fees and emotional upheaval, difficult conversations and necessary confrontations, moments of doubt and periods of loneliness. But every step had been worth it for the simple, fundamental gift of being able to wake up each morning in a place where no one questioned my right to exist with dignity. I thought about Michael's letter still tucked away in my desk drawer and wondered if there would ever come a time when we could rebuild some kind of relationship. Maybe if he continued counseling and demonstrated real understanding of what had happened and his role in allowing it to happen. Maybe if he could prove that he valued his mother's well-being over his own comfort and convenience. Maybe if he learned the difference between keeping the peace and enabling abuse. But that was a decision for the future, and it would be made on my terms, based on evidence of change rather than promises of improvement. I'd learned too much about my own worth and too much about the importance of boundaries to go backward into relationships that required me to make myself smaller, to make other people comfortable. As for Jessica, I honestly hoped she was getting the therapy she clearly needed to understand why she'd felt entitled to treat an elderly woman with such calculated cruelty. But that was her responsibility, not mine. My responsibility was to live the rest of my life in a way that honored both Howard's memory and my own dignity, surrounded by people who understood that age doesn't diminish a person's right to respect and kindness. The last time I'd driven past the old house, the new owners had planted flowers in the front yard and put up a swing set in the back. Children's bicycles were scattered on the driveway, and I could see toys through the windows of what used to be my bedroom. It looked like a happy family home again, the way it had been when Howard and I were raising our children there, before grief and loneliness had made me vulnerable to people who saw those vulnerabilities as opportunities for exploitation. I felt no sadness seeing other people living in the space that had once been mine. That house had served its purpose in my life, providing decades of good memories and a foundation for raising a family. When it stopped serving that purpose and became instead a place where I was diminished and disrespected, it was time to let it go and create something new. That's the thing about reaching 64 years old, having lived through loss and betrayal and the discovery of your own strength. You learn that almost nothing is irreplaceable except your sense of your own worth. Houses can be sold, relationships can be restructured or ended, living situations can be changed, but once you allow someone to convince you that you don't deserve basic human dignity, once you accept being treated as less than human, it becomes exponentially harder to remember that you have the right to demand better. I'd spent months telling myself that Jessica's behavior wasn't that bad, that I was being too sensitive, that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. I'd convinced myself that loneliness was worse than humiliation, that having company was worth accepting contempt, that family loyalty meant swallowing my pride and my self-respect indefinitely. It had taken being forced to eat dog food, actually sitting at my own table, chewing chunks of processed meat while my daughter-in-law took photographs, for me to finally understand that some lines, once crossed, reveal the true nature of the people crossing them. The morning after the dog food incident, when I'd called Charlotte and Ellen and David, when I'd finally said the words out loud, "I need help. This isn't normal. I can't live like this anymore," I'd felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as coming back to life. Not the gradual awakening you experience when recovering from grief, but the sharp, sudden recognition of someone who'd been sleepwalking through her own destruction and had finally woken up in time to save herself. 6 months later, sitting in my own living room in my own townhouse, financially secure and emotionally independent, I understood that the real revenge against Jessica hadn't been the legal consequences or the lost housing arrangement or even the social embarrassment of having her cruelty exposed to the community. The real revenge had been my refusal to remain the victim she needed me to be. She'd constructed an entire dynamic based on my supposed helplessness, my presumed desperation for family connection, my assumed willingness to accept any treatment rather than risk being alone. When I'd chosen independence over abuse, financial security over family drama, and self-respect over the false peace of avoiding conflict, I destroyed the foundation of her entire approach to dealing with me. Jessica had needed me to be weak, grateful, and dependent. Instead, I'd turned out to be strong, resourceful, and perfectly capable of building a better life without her or anyone else who thought my age made me an acceptable target for exploitation. That was the lesson I wished I could share with every woman my age who might be reading this story or hearing it told. You are never too old to start over, never too financially vulnerable to demand dignity, never too lonely to reject abuse, and never too dependent on the family relationships to insist on being treated with basic human respect. The people who love you will find ways to honor those boundaries. The people who don't love you, who see you as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished, will reveal themselves through their responses to your reasonable demands for dignity. And when they reveal themselves, believe them. Don't make excuses for their cruelty. Don't rationalize their disrespect. Don't convince yourself that family loyalty requires accepting treatment you wouldn't tolerate from strangers. When someone shows you that they see your vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation, when they demonstrate that your comfort and dignity matter less to them than their own convenience, when they make it clear that they view your needs as burdens rather than your rights as a human being, believe them and respond accordingly. I learned something else during those months of legal battles and life transitions, something that surprised me with its simplicity and power, the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd been desperately lonely living in my own basement while Jessica and Michael occupied the rest of my house, isolated from meaningful connection even though there were people around me every day. I'd felt like a stranger in my own life, disconnected from my own sense of worth and agency, surrounded by people who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. Now, living alone in my townhouse, I rarely felt lonely. I had chosen solitude rather than having isolation imposed on me, and that choice made all the difference. When I wanted company, I called friends or participated in community activities or spent time with James. When I wanted privacy, I could retreat to my own space without asking permission or worrying about someone else's opinions about my choices. The quality of my relationships had improved dramatically once I'd established that I wouldn't accept relationships that diminished me. 3 years after Howard's death, 2 years after the dog food incident, 1 year after moving into my townhouse, I could honestly say that I was happier and more at peace than I'd been since before my husband's illness began. Not because I'd forgotten him or stopped missing him, but because I'd learned to build a life that honored both his memory and my own continued existence as a person worthy of respect and kindness. The woman who'd sat at her kitchen table eating Alpo while her daughter-in-law took pictures had been someone I barely recognized now. She'd been beaten down by grief, isolated by manipulation, and convinced that accepting cruelty was the price she had to pay for avoiding abandonment. The woman I was now understood that there are worse things than being alone, and that the fear of abandonment becomes meaningless once you've learned to value your own company and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate gratitude. If I could go back and give that woman any advice, it would be this. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Speak up the first time someone crosses a boundary. Remember that your age doesn't make you less deserving of dignity, and never forget that you have more power than people who want to exploit you will ever want you to believe. Don't wait for the dog food moment to realize that you deserve better. Act on that knowledge the first time someone suggests you should be grateful for treatment that makes you feel diminished. And if you're reading this story because someone in your life is making you feel small, unwelcome, or burdensome in your own home, if you're being charged excessive rent to live in spaces that used to be yours, if your opinions are being dismissed as irrelevant, if you're being treated like a dependent child rather than an independent adult, if your contributions are being minimized while your needs are being characterized as unreasonable demands, please understand that you have options, you have rights, and you have more strength than the people mistreating you want you to realize. Call a lawyer. Call a family member who will listen without making excuses for your abusers. Call a friend who will offer you a place to stay while you figure out your next steps. Document the mistreatment, protect your assets, and remember that family relationships that require you to accept abuse in order to maintain them aren't worth maintaining. The people who truly love you will find ways to show that love without diminishing your dignity or exploiting your vulnerabilities. Most importantly, Remember that it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand better, to walk away from situations that diminish you, and to build a life based on self-respect rather than the fear of being alone. Loneliness is temporary and manageable. The damage to your sense of self that comes from accepting ongoing mistreatment is much harder to heal and far more costly to your overall well-being. I'm 66 years old now, living independently in a home I own outright, surrounded by people who treat me with kindness and respect, financially secure enough to make choices based on what I want rather than what I can afford, and more at peace with myself and my life than I've been in years. I got here by refusing to eat any more dog food, literally or metaphorically, and by learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop enabling their worst impulses by refusing to be their victim. The woman who forced me to eat dog food as punishment for having opinions about plumbing repairs is now facing bankruptcy proceedings, a divorce, and the social consequences of her documented cruelty to an elderly family member. I didn't cause those consequences, her own choices and character did. But I'm not sorry about them either. Actions have consequences, cruelty has costs, and people who treat vulnerable family members as entertainment deserve whatever natural results flow from their behavior. As for me, I'm planning a trip to Ireland next spring with Charlotte Camps and 2 other friends from the community. We're going to rent a cottage, explore castles, and spend 2 weeks doing exactly what we want without asking anyone's permission or worrying about anyone else's opinions about our choices. At 66, I'm discovering that life can still hold surprises, adventures, and possibilities I never imagined when I was sitting in that basement, feeling grateful for scraps of dignity from people who should have been honored to know me. That's the real story here. Not just the revenge against cruelty, not just the legal victories or the financial security, but the rediscovery of my own worth and the rebuilding of a life based on that worth. Sometimes the best revenge against people who try to diminish you is simply refusing to stay diminished, choosing to flourish instead, and living well enough that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I learned it thoroughly. And now every morning when I wake up in my own bed in my own house, make coffee in my own kitchen, and plan my day according to my own preferences and priorities, I'm reminded that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to make you feel worthless is to prove them wrong by living a life that demonstrates your value, to yourself and to the people wise enough to recognize it.